Hey, it's Julie. Just really quickly before we dive into today's episode, can I ask you a favor? If you are enjoying Uncomfy, would you consider sharing the podcast with a friend? We love having these conversations and really want to bring more people into the mix so we can all grow together as we get more comfortable with these uncomfy moments. There should be a share button actually right in the app you're using to watch or listen to today's episode. You could just tap it and text or email Uncomfy to a friend who you think might also enjoy these conversations. Okay, thank you so much. Now, let's get into it.
There's a car in my blind spot I don't see. I cut it off. We squeal, we spin. I almost hit him, obviously. And I rolled down my window to apologize. And I see the guy come out of the car, brand new Mercedes. He's got this gold chain. And he looks at me and he says, "You're dead."
Hey, it's Julie. Welcome to Uncomfy, a show about sticking with moments that challenge us. Every single day, it seems like I get some kind of tough feedback where I hear a perspective I disagree with, or I just find myself outside my comfort zone. And the natural reaction is to bail out or lash out even. But if I do that right away, I might miss a chance to learn something or feel new empathy or deepen a relationship. So the question's how, right? How to stick with that discomfort just a little bit longer. Well, that's what this podcast is about. Real people telling real stories of choosing to stay open and curious in challenging moments. I'm glad you're here. Now, let's get uncomfy. Why is it so easy to get outraged about politics? I'm joined by Kurt Gray. He's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab there, and he's got a new book out called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Professor Gray, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
So, outrage. I think it just might be the most common emotion that I experience, which I don't think says an awful lot about me as a person. And I wondered if it's just me. I gather from your book that it's fairly common and actually it's pretty natural in a lot of instances. Tell me about that.
I think it's natural for humans to feel outrage because, we're deeply moral creatures. We evolved to have a moral sense, and part of that moral sense is getting angry and outraged when someone does something that we think is wrong or harmful, I think is the big thing. And I think, our current political moment is structured to make us more outraged than ever with social media and different cable news environments and lots of division. And so it's no wonder you're feeling so outraged today.
So you argue in your book, and I found this really insightful, that in order to understand why we fight and why it's so easy to feel outraged, we need to understand harm, how we perceive harm. Can you expand on that for me?
Yeah. So it's so easy when we disagree today to assume that the other side has a different moral mind, that there's some kind of values that they have that we don't, or vice versa. But I think at the end of the day, and my research support this, all our moral minds are the same, and they're all fixated on one thing, and that is harm. We're all concerned about protecting ourselves and the vulnerable from suffering, which is why we all get so outraged if we see a case of child abuse, for instance. But I think today, right, politics has made questions of harm more ambiguous, right? So what's the most harmful situation when it comes to immigration? Is it opening the borders or closing them? Today, we have competing perceptions of harm. And I think appreciating how different people perceive harm differently can really open us up to feeling less outrage and feeling more understanding.
There's a story in the book that you share that kind of illustrates how two people can both feel like they're being harmed in a scenario more than the other. Would you share that story about being a 16-year-old driver?
Yeah. So it was nighttime. I was driving in the car with my friends to a movie. We were rushing up the road. It had just rained, so the roads were slick. And we're kind of getting close to the movie theater. And I'm about to miss the turn. I don't realize it. My friend yells from the back, "Turn left, turn left." So I'm in the right-hand lane. I pull on the wheel. There's a car in my blind spot I don't see. I cut it off. We squeal, we spin. I almost hit him, obviously. And we're sitting kind of facing the wrong way on the other side of the road. No one's around. Thankfully, no one was harmed. I rolled down my window to apologize, and I see the guy come out of the car, brand new Mercedes. He's got this gold chain, and he looks at me and he says, "You're dead." And I panic and I stomp on the accelerator. He gets in the car. He starts chasing me. We go through these deserted strip malls, and I'm making very bad choices. I'm turning into more and more deserted places. And eventually he corners me in the back of a Home Depot like store, a loading dock. And so no one's around, just kind of me and my four friends in the car. And he kind of corrals us, gets out of the car, says he's going to kill me. Friend in the back says, lock the door, lock the door. So I lock the door, and just in time, he's like reefing at the door handle. I unrolled the window to apologize because I knew I had to de-escalate the situation. He's reaching in the car. He's slapping me around. He's grabbing my collar. He's kind of like jerking me left and right. So I'm apologizing. And then eventually my friend in the back, the one who had the presence of mind to say, lock the door, she says, holding up a cell phone, rare at the time, it was the late 90s. She says, I've got a cell phone. I'll call the cops if you don't stop. And he slaps me for a little bit more, and then he pauses and he says, yeah, you call the cops and I'll tell them what you did. It's a weird situation, right? Because even though I was terrified, there was still this moment where I was like, what? Like you tell them what I did? You're literally assaulting me right now, threatening to kill me. But obviously from his perspective, he felt victimized. He felt like I cut him off. He felt in danger. And so this kind of story, we're on the opposite side of a moral divide, not politics here, but, a kind of moral situation we're both feeling really big feelings about. And that kind of, moment set the stage for much of my research career in moral psychology.
So what is the light bulb then around harm, around sort of what was going on in that moment that you think applies to a lot of big disagreements we have in the world today?
Yeah, big disagreements, small disagreements too, turns out. So we disagreed about who the true victim was. And if you think about, fights about immigration or fights about euthanasia or abortion or taxes, like questions of like, who's the victim and who do we need to protect most? Right? That's at the root of all these moral disagreements. And if you think about arguments with your partner, with your spouse, with your coworker, right? You're like, I feel like you're victimizing me in this way. And they say, what? You're not the victim. I'm the victim here. Right? And so whether it's big or small, these kind of moral arguments come down to, who's being harmed unfairly.
So when you think about a political disagreement, do conservatives and liberals tend to sort of view harm in different, or who victimization in kind of different ways that we can chart in order to explain like why we would have such opposite views on many of these issues, like immigration or abortion, for example?
Yes and no. So I do want to say that, as I do research, and many people have done, research looking into the, moral judgments of liberals and conservatives, there's so much similarity. But I think you can simplify it maybe a little bit for listeners right now, which is that, when liberals think about victimhood, they think often about group-based victimhood, kind of, let's say, like statistical victimization. So it's a fact that some people belonging to some groups are more likely to be victimized than others. But conservatives are more likely to emphasize kind of individual victimhood, kind of looking not at the kind of statistical group-based suffering, but just in the raw kind of possibility of victimization. So these kind of different understandings of victimization can explain debates like affirmative action. So progressives are like, look, here's this historical inequality. We need to address this. We need to lift up people from particular groups. Conservatives say, look, it doesn't matter if you're black or white, you still work hard for school and you're still upset if you don't get into the school you want to get into. And so I think, by having these lenses, group-based or individual kind of victimization, makes sense of many debates, in fact.
So it can help make sense of why we're so divided. And I have to say, since reading your book, I see this playing out everywhere on social media, in the comment thread. But the question then is like, well, what good does it really do us? Okay, so, on one side of an issue, I am completely convinced that we're causing unacceptable harm to this, in this way. And the other side of the issue says, no, to not do this is to cause unacceptable harm. It seems like you're really just at an impasse. How can this actually help us to, as your subtitle of your book indicates, find common ground?
Well, I think there's immense power, one, in understanding what's really going on, right? Because if you're focused on the wrong thing, you think the wrong thing causes disagreement, then you're kind of off looking for finding common ground somewhere that you shouldn't be looking. And I think understanding that everyone's kind of worried about harm is very useful because it provides a kind of single common ground, a common currency, a master key to unlock understanding, right? So one thing you can do is kind of initially just ask yourself when you're approached with some moral conflict, right? Like, what harm does the other person see? Who are they trying to protect, right? Like, what threats are they focused on? And I think that alone can help you kind of see the other side as more human. But I think, and I've got research related to this, I think it helps us find common ground as well, because it turns out that sharing our personal experiences of harm, they go a long way to making us seem more rational and more human to the other side, right? Listening and understanding kind of people's concerns about harm helps humanize them and helps us feel empathy for them.
So can you share an example of how this actually plays out, like sort of how you've been able to prove this in your lab?
You bet. So here's the study that we ran that I really like. We had one research assistant. She was an accomplice. She was walking around campus, the University of North Carolina. And then we found another person, a passerby, maybe like an alum, coming back to visit. And we'd say, oh, hey, two people on campus. Can y'all talk about politics? And the person would be like, sure, that's fine. And so we say, great, you're going to talk about guns. And okay, we can talk about that. And then, our accomplice seems pretty nice. She's like a 20-year-old college student. But she goes right into it, right? And she says, what do you believe in guns? And usually the person's pro-gun control. And she says, well, you know what? I'm pro-gun rights. And here's why I think that. I think anyone who thinks otherwise is un-American. And why I think this is, and then she either gave a fact, which is here's how many people in America every year defend themselves with guns, or a personal experience, which is when I was a kid, my mom used a handgun to defend herself from a home intruder. So one is actually statistics, right? It's like actually true. And the other is just something that happened to her, but obviously, true to her. And then we recorded the conversations and rated how much the passerby, the actual participant, treated our accomplice with respect based on whether she gave a fact or an experience. And we found that in this study and every other study we looked at, whether it's about social media or conversations on Fox News or CNN, conversations had more respect when people used personal experiences because they seem more true, and the person seemed like they were more rational when they ground their political beliefs in something frightening or dangerous or harmful that happened to them.
So it's just, wow. It seems so, it really is counterintuitive, like you mentioned, because you would think that speaking clearly and rationally, like a lot of times we think that personal experiences are just like overly emotional or, on some level, not good justification for sound decisions or a position on an issue. And yet sharing, this is why I feel this way, or this is how I've come to hold this viewpoint because of, and especially harm stories. So that's like, it's not just like, here's my personal experience, but here is how I have experienced harm. And therefore, this is why I hold that position. It's strange to think that would work.
Well, I mean, think about it. Like, your moral convictions are not the same kind of, like, what's the best car to buy? You could be like, oh, I look at consumer reports. I look at like reliability ratings. I look at like how much you need to like repair it. You can look at its horsepower. I don't know. There's lots of metrics. You're like, what's the best moral belief? Facts don't really come to bear in the same way. Like, if we're having an argument about some moral issue, immigration, abortion, taxes, like, think when the last time you heard like just the right fact that made you give up your moral convictions, you know? You're like, I know you believe this about immigration, but I heard this fact on a podcast, and like, what do you think now, huh? You're not like, oh my God, you're right. Now that I know this fact, you're right. I'm going to change my view about immigration or abortion. Never, right? Because that moral beliefs are not like that. They're grounded in these like gut feelings of harm that are like deeper than kind of some statistic. And so if you know that someone has a gut feeling of harm about a particular issue because they experienced it, it makes them seem human and rational in a way that just parroting something you learned on Fox News or CNN doesn't work.
So what are the key steps to this is there like a cheat sheet that you give to your students that we could share with people?
There is a cheat sheet. I have kind of like three easy tips. They're maybe not so easy, but that kind of overarching idea is understand, right? Don't try to win. If you're trying to win, you've already lost, right? So just try to understand at first. But the 3 easy steps, which are not easy, are CIV, connect, invite, and validate. CIV. Connect is before you talk about politics, like you see someone wearing a red hat or you see someone wearing like a Kamala shirt, like don't just go into politics, right? Connect with them as a human being. We're so much more than politics, right? There's so much that define us. Our kids, our hobbies, our taste in food, what music we listen to, like where we grew up, where we went to school, our fashion sense, like it's limitless. All the things that we are, like we contain multitudes. And so tap into those multitudes with questions. You can ask questions. Hey, like what's your favorite band? Like what's the meal you had that you love? Or like, is there a family member that, that you wish you talked to more, right? People like having deeper conversations. Like you don't have to talk about the weather every time. You can talk about something deeper. So let's connect. And then once you've connected with someone as a human being a little more, you can invite them. Hey, I know, it's a kind of awkward to ask this question. You don't have to share now, right? By the way, an invitation you can say no to, right? That's an actual invitation. But I'd love to hear, your thoughts on immigration. And I know it's probably different than what I think, but I'd just love to kind of understand where you're coming from. If you're willing to share, that's great. If not, we can talk later. It's fine. Invitation, right? And then they're going to tell you something. It's going to be hard for them to share. They're going to feel like kind of vulnerable. They're probably going to say something a little offensive to you because they're like in, talk radio land or whatever. And then the V is validate. And so they're going to tell you what they think. And your job is not to be like, oh my God, you think that? What? You're going to say, oh, okay, I appreciate you sharing. Thanks very much. As you know, I disagree. Like I wouldn't see it that way myself, but I really appreciate you saying that. And here's where I think you're coming from, right? The reason that you're pro-life is because I think you're trying to protect fetuses from harm and you think that's important. And, here we go, right? I'm trying to reframe. I'm trying to like rephrase. I'm trying to make sense. I'm acknowledging where you're coming from. You're feeling seen and feeling heard. And then, and only then, right? And we're talking like 20 minutes into the conversation now. Do you be like, well, here's kind of my perspective where I'm coming from. And like, you can tell me, how this connects up with like, your concerns and your concerns about harm and threats or whatever. And then you share, right? And you maybe share a story. But yeah, it's a long process and it's uncomfy for sure, but I think it's possible and it's useful.
And where does the sharing stories of harm piece fit into that rubric?
So I think after you've done the CIV, then you share a story of harm, or you encourage the person you're talking with to share their story of harm.
And so how would I ask for that, right? Can you share with me an experience where you feel like you've been hurt by this policy? I mean, is it that straightforward?
I mean, it's awkward, right? This is a great thing about these conversations. They're awkward, they're uncomfy, right? So the fact that you're like, I don't know how to say, like no one knows how to say this, right?
Yeah.
Like imagine you're going on a date and you're like trying to figure out who someone is, right? There's awkward pauses that, there's like fumbling, like, and this is a date's a person like we're like, well, I think I'm probably attracted to this person. This is a conversation where like, I think this person might be evil. You know what I'm saying? It's like very different. And so I think you did a good job there. I mean, you could just be like, hey, like, we could talk about kind of talking heads all we want or social media, but like, I want to hear about you. I want to understand you, and I want to make this personal. So like, I'm interested in like, how questions of immigration might have affected you and your family. Like, I just wonder if you could share what it means to you personally and whether there's anything in your past that like really connects up. And then once they share, you could be like, oh, that's great. Here's a story that happened to me, right? And now you're sharing stories like a friend or a family member. You're not like, here's what I heard on NPR. And you're like, well, here's what I heard on Fox News, That's like a very different conversation.
Yeah. It's all really just about trying to see that other person as a human and to be seen as a human, I guess. And to sort of recognize that I do think it's quite powerful, this idea that we see things so differently and are so quick to get outraged because fundamentally we have the same urge. It's just, and that is to sort of want to prevent harm to the most vulnerable. It's just that we have our antenna often aimed at different vulnerable entities.
Yeah, right. And I think it's so powerful because it doesn't mean that the other side's immoral. It means that they make different kind of assumptions about harm, right? It's like there's different, to go back to the idea of facts, like there's different assumptions about the world, but ultimately, like we all agree we should be protecting people and the vulnerable from harm. We just have different like kind of starting assumptions feeding into that.
But if you can find that thing that you agree on, that's where the common ground begins then. I mean, do you think that it's actually possible for totally different views of who's being harmed by a specific policy or action to actually have enough agreement to be able to agree on a policy moving forward?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I don't think that people should be giving up their convictions. I think disagreement is okay. America is founded on, pluralism. Like we want different views, and when there's only one view represented, well, that's not a democracy. That's a dictatorship, right? So I think we're stronger for our differences as long as we let those differences thrive and we're willing to have conversations about that. I mean, there's so many programs that are like, let's try to kind of like create policy and kind of agree enough to pass that policy. And there's one program that basically agreed on passing policy about healthcare, and they could only come to this agreement by basically secretly taking these legislators, having a day of sharing experiences and kind of bonding, and then finding the one thing in all these murky issues that they all agreed on was harmful and unjustly so, and that was emergency medical billing. So left, right, no one thinks you should go bankrupt because your kid broke their arm, And so lawmakers could work together to kind of pass this bill once they had set aside their kind of partisan identities and they realized that this is harmful and that no one, should have to do this. And so I think it is possible, and there are examples of legislation being passed. It's hard to do it in kind of today's divided social media, pick a party and, die on that hill, but I think it is possible.
Kurt Gray is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his new book is called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. I found it really insightful, and it's kind of coloring the way I see the world right now. So I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Professor Gray. Thanks for taking time today.
I appreciate it too. Thank you.
And thank you for getting uncomfy with us today. Are you avoiding conversations with people you disagree with? Have you dared to try to have one? And how has it gone for you? I'd love to hear your story. Maybe we'll even share it on the podcast. You can reach me uncomfy@byu.edu or reach out on our social media channels. And be sure to check out my other podcast, Top of Mind with Julie Rose. Every episode takes one tough topic. We don't take a side, and we look for these perspectives like Professor Gray was referencing, where we could hear different ways that people are perceiving the effects of important issues, different ways that we're perceiving harm, trying to look at things through a slightly different lens so that we can build our empathy muscle and find more common ground. So the podcast is called Top of Mind with Julie Rose. I'd love to have you add it to your listening queue. Uncomfy is a BYU radio podcast. Samuel Benson produces it, and the team includes Enrique Prado, James Hoops, and Sam Payne. Our theme music was composed by Kelsey Ney. I'm Julie Rose. Can't wait to get uncomfy with you again next week. Hey there, friends. I want to take just a quick moment and dive into another gem of a podcast from the BYU radio family. It's The Lisa Show, hosted by Lisa Valentine Clark. She's a comedian, an actress, a believer, and a single mom. And she was even our very first guest on Uncomfy, you may remember, talking about a really uncomfortable conversation with a close friend of hers. So, what's The Lisa Show about? Well, it's kind of like sitting down to chat with your favorite people about what's going on in life, all of life's challenges. They tackle parenting, mental health, social issues, always with a lot of laughs because it's Lisa. So if you are up for figuring out this crazy thing called life, give The Lisa Show a listen. You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts.